Municipal Auditorium, Birmingham, Alabama, March 1952. Nat King Cole stood in the wings watching the house fill. He'd done this hundreds of times, the ritual before a performance, reading the room, sensing the energy, gauging the crowd. It was instinct by now, natural as breathing. But tonight, like every night on this southern tour, there was something else to read: the rope. A thick cotton rope strung on brass stanchions down the center aisle of the auditorium, dividing the house precisely in two. Left section, black audience members taking their seats in the designated area. Right section, white audience members filling the premium seats closest to the stage. Same building, same performance, same ticket price, different sides of a rope. Nat watched from the wings as a black family, a father, mother, two teenage daughters, found their seats on the left. The father held the tickets, checked the row numbers, directed his family. The daughters were dressed carefully, excited for the performance, one of them holding the program already open. 40 feet away, on the right side of the same rope, a white couple settled into their seats, shrugging off their coats, comfortable in the reserved section closest to the stage. Both groups had paid to hear Nat King Cole sing. Both would hear the same music. But they couldn't sit together, a length of rope said so. Nat turned to his road manager Sherman Sneed and said nothing. There was nothing to say. They'd both seen this before. They'd see it again. He walked to the stage. Before we dive into how Nat King Cole performed show after show in southern and border state venues where concert hall managers physically divided his audience by race using ropes, barriers, and designated sections, how he stood on stage and saw both halves of a divided America looking back at him every single night, and what it cost a man of extraordinary warmth and connection to perform across a rope he didn't put there and couldn't remove. Let me ask, where are you watching from? Drop a comment, because this story about the physical architecture of racism is as relevant in 2026 as it was in 1952. The divided concert was not a Southern invention alone. Border states practiced it. Some northern cities with significant Southern migration practiced versions of it. The geography of the rope was wider than people acknowledged, but the Deep South was where it was most formalized, where the division was most explicit, most enforced, most routine. The system worked through coordination between venue managers and touring agencies. When Nat's booking agent negotiated a Southern engagement, the venue's seating policy was understood by everyone involved, not stated explicitly in contracts, not acknowledged in promotional materials, just understood. Capacity 200 meant 600 on each side of a rope. The venues didn't build special walls, didn't construct separate facilities for each performance. That would have cost money. A rope was cheaper. Stanchions were portable. The physical apparatus of segregation could be assembled before showtime and removed after. It left no permanent mark on the building, just on the people inside it. Nat's touring life in the early and mid-1950s required him to internalize this reality. He performed at roughly 60 to 80 concerts a year. In the South and border states, perhaps a third of those. Venues divided the house. That meant 20, 25, sometimes 30 divided concerts in a given year. 25 occasions to walk onto a stage and see the rope before he sang the first note. What do you do with that? You perform. That's what you do. You deliver the same warmth, the same engagement, the same musical excellence to both sides of the rope. You look left and you look right, and you give the same performance to black audience members who could afford the tickets but not the better seats, and to white audience members who sat in those better seats without choosing them or questioning them. That was the professional expectation. That was what the booking required. That was what his audience, both halves of it, had paid to receive. But the psychological weight of performing across a visible racial division night after night, that was real, and it accumulated. Maria Cole traveled with Nat sometimes on these tours. She saw the divided houses, saw her husband prepare for performances in venues that announced, through architecture and rope, that black and white Americans were not equal even when paying the same price for the same entertainment. She later described watching Nat in the wings before these shows. He'd look at the house and something would go quiet in him, not sad exactly, more like a door closing. He'd close something off before he walked out there, because if you let yourself feel what the rope meant, you couldn't perform. You couldn't give people what they came for, so he'd close the door on it and then he'd walk out and give them everything. Closing the door was the adaptation, the professional necessity, the survival mechanism that allowed him to do his job while his job required him to perform inside a physical symbol of his own inferior status. The white audiences in the right section didn't think of it that way. For most of them, the seating arrangement was simply the seating arrangement, the way it always was, the way the auditorium was organized. They weren't thinking about the rope when Nat sang Unforgettable. They were thinking about the music. That was its own kind of revelation about privilege. The rope was visible to everyone in the room, but only one group carried its meaning into their bodies while the music played. Nat's road manager Sherman Sneed handled the practical negotiations around divided venues. Sneed was experienced, pragmatic, understood the landscape of touring black artists through the South. He knew which venues would accept certain technical requirements, which managers could be persuaded on particular points where the practical limits of negotiation were. On the question of divided seating, there were no practical limits to negotiate. This wasn't a dressing room condition or a technical rider item. This was the law in many jurisdictions, the policy in others, the immovable expectation of Southern venue culture in the early 1950s. The Jim Crow laws were explicit in some states. Public facilities, including places of entertainment, were required to maintain racial separation. A concert promoter who integrated seating in Mississippi or Alabama in 1952 risked fines, threatened operating licenses, sometimes worse. The rope wasn't the venue manager's individual racism. It was the law. It was the culture. It was the physical requirement of operating a public entertainment facility in the segregated South. That context didn't make the rope less visible from the stage. It just meant there was no one to argue with about it. The institutional force behind that rope was the full weight of Southern law and culture. A touring musician couldn't fight it by refusing to perform. That would simply mean the show didn't happen and the audience on both sides went home. So Nat performed, and he looked at the rope each time. One night in Shreveport, Louisiana, 1953, a midweek show at a civic auditorium, something happened that Sherman Sneed described years later. Nat was midway through his set. He played his usual mix of hits and ballads, warming the room on both sides of the rope. The audience was engaged, both sections leaning forward slightly, the particular collective attention of an audience genuinely moved by what they're hearing. A young black man in the left section, maybe 22, 23 years old, began crying. Quietly, not making a scene, just tears moving down his face as Nat sang. His girlfriend beside him noticed, put her hand in his. Nat saw it from the stage, could see the left section clearly. It was well lit, intimate. He saw the young man's face. He didn't pause the song, didn't break his performance, but something shifted in how he directed his attention for the next few minutes. He sang slightly more toward the left section, held eye contact longer with the audience in that half of the room. It was subtle. Most of the house probably didn't notice. Sherman noticed, and after the show, in the car back to the hotel, the Black Hotel, because none of the decent hotels in Shreveport would take them, Sherman mentioned it. Nat said, he was listening the way you listen when you're not supposed to be there. I know that feeling. That was it. He didn't elaborate, didn't philosophize, just said what he saw and what he understood. The young man had been listening the way black Americans listened to things that were technically available to them, but that the physical architecture of the country constantly reminded them were not fully theirs to enjoy. The way you listen when you're in the segregated section, behind the rope, in the worst seats, for the same price. Nat knew that feeling because it was his feeling too. He was on the stage, not behind the rope, but he was there because he was the act. He couldn't sit in the right section either. After the performance, he'd leave through the service exit. That was another story, another rope of a different kind. The emotional complexity of performing for a divided audience wasn't something Nat discussed publicly. Like so many aspects of the indignities he absorbed as a black performer in a segregated industry, he kept it private. What he gave publicly was the performance, consistent, warm, professional. What he kept privately was the accumulation, the 25th rope of the year, the 30th, the look at the house from the wings that told him before the first note exactly what kind of room this was. There was one incident that his horn player Eddie Cole, Nat's brother, who toured with him intermittently, described. After a divided show in Memphis, 1954, Nat came off stage and walked directly to the back of the venue without speaking to anyone, stood alone for several minutes near the loading dock. When Eddie found him, Nat was standing in the dark, completely still. "You okay?" He asked. The rope was 10 feet from the stage tonight, Nat said. 10 feet, I could have touched it. He paused. I kept thinking about what it would look like if I just walked over and took it down. He hadn't, of course. That would have ended the show, created an incident, potentially endangered the audience members on the left side who had no protection if things turned ugly. But I thought about it, he said to Eddie. The whole set, I thought about it. He walked back inside. Did the second show. By 1956, Nat King Cole had become an outspoken advocate against segregated venues, even as he continued to perform in them out of financial necessity and contractual obligation. He began refusing to sign new contracts with venues that required divided seating when he had the leverage to do so. The leverage wasn't always there. His career had peaks and valleys like any performer's. When money was tight, when tour needed to be booked, the divided venues sometimes came back into the schedule. But the public statements were on record. In interviews, he said plainly that he believed audiences should be able to sit together, that a rope down the middle of a concert hall was an insult to everyone in the room, not just to the people on the left side of it. The white audiences who attended divided performances in these years were participants in the system whether they thought about it or not. Some were uncomfortable with the arrangement, some didn't think about it at all, some believed in it. What none of them had to do was stand on a stage and look at it from a distance of 10 feet while performing their best work. That specific experience, the performer's view of his own. Audience's division belonged to Nat and to the musicians on stage with him. The piano player who could see both sections, the bassist who watched the rope sway slightly when people walked past it, the horn section who could hear both halves of the crowd react slightly differently to the same notes. The black musicians had the particular experience of performing on the integrated stage because the musicians themselves weren't divided by the rope. They worked together regardless, while looking out at an audience divided by one. The stage was the most integrated space in the building. Every other space conformed to segregation, the two sides of the audience, the separate entrance Nat and his band used, the separate hotel they'd return to after. But on the stage, they performed together. Looking out at the divided house from the integrated stage had its own particular meaning, a small, temporary island of what equality looked like, surrounded by the architecture of what the country actually was. Nat King Cole performed across the rope for years, gave the same warmth to both sides, closed the door on what he felt about it and opened the door on the music. By the early 1960s, as the civil rights movement created legal pressure that would eventually overturn Jim Crow, the divided concert halls began integrating. First in some northern border states, then gradually in the South as federal law made segregated public accommodations illegal. The ropes came down, the stanchions were packed away. Venues that had divided their audiences for decades sent single-section seating charts to touring agencies. Nat performed in fully integrated houses in the last years of his life, saw his audience sitting together. Both sides of where the rope had been now merged into one continuous crowd. He never wrote about what that felt like, never gave a speech about it. Wasn't one for dramatic gestures of that kind. But his road manager Sherman Sneed described one early integrated performance in a venue that had previously divided its audience. Nat came off stage and said quietly to Sherman, "It looks different from up there." That was all. It looks different from up there. The stage he'd stood on for years, looking out at divided America, now showed him something else. The same people, the same music, no rope. He'd been seeing the potential of that view from the beginning, had been performing toward it through 25, 30, 40 divided houses a year, had closed the door on what the rope meant and opened the door on what music could reach across. When the rope was finally gone, the music was the same, the warmth was the same, the connection was the same. It just looked different from up there, and Nat King Cole, who had stood on those stages and seen both halves of his audience divided by a length of cotton rope on brass stanchions, knew exactly what had changed, and what had always been true, that the music had never recognized the rope, even when he had to. The touring economics made refusing divided venues nearly impossible. Southern and border state markets represented a quarter to a third of Nat's touring income. White performers didn't face this calculation, their audiences sat together everywhere. For Nat, every divided venue booking was a negotiation between professional reality and what he was walking into. He wasn't naive about the rope's meaning. He simply operated in a world where refusing to enter the building wouldn't make it go away. White audience members attended as if divided seating were simply normal. They hadn't chosen the arrangement, just found the seat their ticket assigned. Black audience members attended knowing exactly what the rope meant, having navigated 1,000 similar mechanisms their entire lives. The divided concert hall was just the most visible form. They came anyway to hear Nat, to experience his music, to have an evening the rope could divide but couldn't entirely diminish. That was the quiet resilience of the left section. They showed up, dressed carefully, brought families, applauded, refused to let the rope reduce their experience. Nat saw that resilience from the stage every night. The family who'd driven 2 hours, the couple who'd saved for tickets, the young man standing in back because seats were full. He performed for them with the same completeness he performed for anyone, maybe more. His guitar player John Collins described Nat's habit in divided houses, ending the set by walking to the front of stage and addressing both sections equally before the final bow, walking left, acknowledging that section, walking right, acknowledging that section, returning to center. He never mentioned the rope. It was a small choreography most audiences didn't notice as deliberate. But Collins noticed because Nat did it every time, without fail, in every divided house. It was the only thing he could control, Collins said years later, where he looked, how he distributed his attention. He couldn't take the rope down, but he could make sure that when he looked out at the room, both halves knew they'd been seen equally. That small act of equal attention, deliberate, consistent, private in its meaning while public in its execution, was characteristic of how Nat managed the indignities his career required him to absorb. He found what he could control, did it with complete intentionality, and never talked about it. The rope divided his audience. His gaze refused to honor that division. That was the quiet rebellion available to a performer standing on a stage with a rope 10 feet away, small, invisible to most, real to everyone who needed it to be.